You embarrass me. I'm disgusted by you.
My daughter-in-law said that at my grandson's graduation dinner. I just smiled. I had been waiting for this. I waved to a waiter, and a video began to play on the television. I made the shrew faint.
I'm glad you're here.
Follow my story to the end and comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I had been married twice, buried one husband, and raised 3 children. At 67, I thought I had seen every shade of human cruelty. I was wrong. The dining room of the Willow Creek estate hummed with the kind of subdued excitement that only graduation dinners can bring. Crystal glasses clinked softly against fine china, and the quiet murmur of congratulations filled the elegant room. My grandson Timothy, cap and gown swapped for a sharp navy suit, sat at the head of our table, beaming with the confidence of a young man who had just conquered the world. Stanford University, full scholarship, the pride swelling in my chest felt almost too big for my ribs. Grandma, did you see Professor Miller's face when I gave my speech? Timothy leaned towards me, his eyes bright with excitement. I think I actually brought him to tears. I reached over and squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses he'd earned from summer construction jobs to pay for his studies. You always had a way with words, my dear. Your grandfather would have been so proud. Then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Oh, please. The voice cut through our moment like a knife through silk. Let's not pretend this is some fairy tale success story. All heads turned to Stephanie, my daughter-in-law, who sat stiffly in her chair, wearing that particular smile she reserved for moments when she wanted blood. Her perfectly manicured fingers clutched her wine glass so tightly I feared it might shatter. Stephanie, my son Kenneth warned quietly, but she was already beyond restraint. She rose slowly, deliberately. Her designer dress caught the chandelier light as she turned to me. Conversations at neighboring tables hushed as people sensed the shift in our little corner of the room. You want to know what I really think of this whole charade? Her voice carried just far enough to reach the adjacent tables, where familiar faces from our social circle turned with thinly veiled curiosity. This woman, she pointed directly at me, has been playing the devoted grandmother for years, but the truth is, she's nothing but an embarrassment. My stomach clenched, but I kept my face carefully neutral. I had learned long ago not to give Stephanie the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Mom, stop. Kenneth's voice held a note of desperation I'd heard too many times. But Stephanie had only just begun. She stepped closer to my chair. Her voice rose with each word. You want to know what your precious grandmother really is, Timothy? She's a fraud, a pathetic old woman who can't even dress appropriately for her own grandson's graduation dinner. I glanced down at my navy blue dress, conservative, well-cut, suitable for the occasion, but I knew this wasn't really about my clothes. You embarrass me, Stephanie continued. Her voice now carried through half the dining room. Every time we're out in public together, I have to pretend you're not a complete social disaster. You say the wrong things. You dress like you shop at thrift stores, and you have no idea how to behave around him. Stephanie, that's enough. No, it's not enough. She turned back to me, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that went beyond mere dislike. It was contempt, pure and simple. I've endured the embarrassment of being associated with you for years, making excuses for 15 years, trying to minimize the damage you've caused in our lives simply by existing. She leaned closer to me. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more violent than her shout. You disgust me, Carol. I look at you and I feel sick that you're supposedly family. The words hit me like physical blows, but in that moment, something strange happened. Instead of the shame and pain I might have expected, a calm settled over me, a peaceful, almost pleasant serenity. I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, nothing dramatic or obvious, just a small, satisfied curve of my lips that seemed to confuse Stephanie more than any tears or protests would have. With calm hands, I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. With deliberate movements, I caught the attention of Kevin, our regular waiter, and gave him a subtle nod. What are you doing? Stephanie asked. Some of her confidence waned as she noticed my composure. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched as Kevin walked to the small control panel near the bar, where the restaurant's ambient music system was managed. The quiet jazz that had been playing died, replaced by the unmistakable sound of a video. It began. The large flat-screen TV on the opposite wall, which usually displayed the club's weekly calendar, flickered to life with a very different image. Stephanie spun to face the screen, and I watched as the color drained from her face like water disappearing down a drain. "No," she whispered. But yes, there she was, crystal clear in high definition, in what was clearly an attorney's office. The timestamp showed a date from only 6 months ago. "So, you want to completely sever all ties?" The attorney's voice came through the restaurant's sound system with perfect clarity. "Completely," Stephanie's recorded voice replied on screen. "I don't want her to have any legal claim to contact or visitation. As far as I'm concerned, I never had a daughter." The blood drained so quickly from Stephanie's face that I thought she might faint right there. She stumbled backward, clutching the table edge for support. "What is this?" Kenneth's voice was barely more than a whisper. On the screen, the conversation continued. "And you understand that this means she will have no support system, no family connection whatsoever?" "Good," Stephanie's recorded voice replied coldly. "Maybe that will finally teach her that actions have consequences." That's when Stephanie's knees gave out completely. She collapsed into her chair with such force that it slid backward, and then she simply folded forward onto the table, unconscious. The dining room erupted in whispers and gasps, but I remained perfectly still, watching the video continue to play, broadcasting my daughter-in-law's deepest secret to everyone who mattered in her carefully constructed social world. I had been waiting for this moment for exactly 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, ever since the private investigator I hired delivered that recording along with a file folder full of other materials that made my hands tremble with rage, on my kitchen table. Tonight, finally, everyone would know what Stephanie truly was. 4 months earlier, I was arranging flowers in my kitchen when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but at my age, unexpected visitors usually meant either someone selling something I didn't need, or a neighbor with gossip I probably didn't want to hear. The man at my door didn't look at all like I imagined a private investigator would. Mr. Miller was in his 50s, wearing a simple gray suit that had seen better days, and carrying a worn leather briefcase that suggested he'd been in this business a long time. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much of humanity's dark side. "Mrs. Peterson," his voice was cautious, professional. "I believe you're expecting me." I had hired him 3 weeks earlier after a conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, had planted a seed of suspicion I couldn't shake. She had mentioned seeing Stephanie at a law firm downtown, which seemed odd, as Stephanie never told the family anything about legal matters. Mrs. Johnson's cousin worked there as a receptionist. She said, "Family law firm. Please come in." I led him to my kitchen table, the same table where I had made the call to hire him. My hands had trembled as I dialed the number I'd found online. Mr. Miller placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. "I must tell you, Mrs. Peterson, what I found was more extensive than what you originally asked me to investigate." My stomach clenched. I had asked him to look into why Stephanie might be visiting an attorney. I hadn't prepared for extensive. "Before I show you anything," he continued, pulling out a thick file folder, "I need you to understand that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Sometimes, ignorance truly is bliss." I looked at the folder, then back at his weathered face. "Mr. Miller, I've been married twice, buried 1 husband, and largely raised 3 children on my own. I've learned that the truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than living with a beautiful lie." He nodded slowly and opened the folder. The first document was a legal petition, dated 18 months prior. As I read the heading, my vision actually blurred for a moment. "Petition for termination of parental rights, voluntary relinquishment." "She has another daughter," Mr. Miller said softly, "Amanda Smith. She's 23 now." My hands began to tremble before I finished reading the first paragraph. Stephanie had voluntarily terminated her parental rights to a daughter from a previous relationship, not because she was young and unprepared, not because of financial hardship. The petition clearly stated she was relinquishing her rights because she was moving forward with a new family unit and wanted to avoid complications. "There's more," Mr. Miller said, "and I wasn't sure I could bear more. The next document was a report from a social worker. Amanda had been 15 when Stephanie abandoned her, left in the care of an elderly grandmother who died only 2 years later. The girl had aged out of the foster care system with no family support, no college funds, no safety net whatsoever.
Where is she now?
My voice came out as a whisper. She's working 2 jobs downtown in Chicago, trying to put herself through community college. She's been entirely on her own since she was 17. I stared at the photo Mr. Miller handed me. Amanda had Timothy's eyes, those same warm brown eyes that came from my son Kenneth's side of the family. She had Stephanie's delicate bone structure, but something in her expression was all her own. A weariness, a strength that spoke of someone who had learned too young that the world could be a cold and unforgiving place. She knows nothing of her family, Mr. Miller continued. As far as Amanda is concerned, her mother disappeared from her life and never looked back. She has no idea Stephanie remarried and built the life Amanda never had. The room seemed to spin. I clung to the table edge, trying to process what I was learning.
How did you find all this out?
Mostly public records. Court filings are accessible if you know where to look. I also talked to some folks who knew her before Stephanie left Chicago. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Mrs. Peterson, there's something else you need to know about why she left. I wasn't sure I could bear another revelation, but I nodded for him to continue. Amanda was getting too old, too independent, starting to ask questions about her father, wanting to know more about her mother's past. According to her former neighbors, Stephanie seemed to view Amanda more as a burden than a daughter, someone who might interfere with her plans to start fresh. The words hit me like physical blows. I thought of Timothy, of how much love and pride Stephanie publicly showed him. Was it all just a show? Was she capable of loving any child? Or was Timothy just young enough to be useful for her image? There's a video, Mr. Miller said softly.
Video.
I was able to obtain footage from the law firm's surveillance cameras. Your daughter-in-law was very explicit about her intentions and her feelings towards Amanda during her meeting with the attorney. That's when he handed me the USB drive that would change everything. I watched it that night alone in my living room, curtains drawn and door locked. Seeing Stephanie sitting in that attorney's office, talking about her own daughter with such cold detachment, made me physically ill. She spoke about Amanda as if she were disposing of an unwanted piece of furniture. But it was more than just the abandonment that horrified me. It was the calculation behind it. Stephanie had thoroughly researched the legal process. She had ensured that Amanda could not contact her in the future, that her past could not disrupt her new life with Kenneth and Timothy. She had erased her own daughter with the same casual efficiency with which someone would delete old files from a computer. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking of Amanda, working 2 jobs, struggling through school with no family support. I thought of Timothy, the grandson Stephanie so publicly adored, and wondered what would happen if he ever became inconvenient for her image. But most of all, I thought of my son Kenneth, who had no idea he had married a woman capable of abandoning her own child. I knew I had to do something. But what? How do you tell your son that his wife isn't who she pretends to be? How do you explain that the woman he loves cast aside her own daughter like trash? More importantly, how do you ensure it never happens again? That's when I began to plan. I tasked Mr. Miller with finding Amanda, to learn everything about her current situation. I discovered she was struggling but determined, working as a night security guard and weekend barista to pay for her classes. She lived in a studio apartment that swallowed most of her income, but she was making it through sheer willpower. I also had Mr. Miller continue monitoring Stephanie's activities. I wanted to know if there were other secrets, other victims of her particular brand of cold calculation. What he found was a pattern that made my blood run cold. Stephanie had done this before, not abandoned children. Amanda was her only child before Kenneth, but she had systematically isolated herself from anyone who knew her past, anyone who might contradict the image she wanted to project. Former friends, distant relatives, even her own mother, all cut off without explanation once they were no longer useful to her carefully constructed persona. My daughter-in-law wasn't just selfish or self-centered, she was a predator specializing in emotional manipulation, and my family was her current hunting ground. I spent weeks agonizing over what to do with this information. Should I tell Kenneth immediately? Should I contact Amanda? Should I confront Stephanie directly? But then I remembered something my first husband always used to say: the best way to catch a liar is to let them keep talking. So I waited. I watched. I documented. And I began to plan for the day Stephanie would finally show her true colors to everyone who mattered. I didn't have to wait long. The video continued to play while Stephanie lay unconscious, her head red on the white tablecloth, as if she'd simply decided to take a nap in the middle of her own destruction. The restaurant staff had quickly cleared the surrounding tables, but not fast enough to prevent half of the Willow Creek estate from witnessing my daughter-in-law's carefully guarded secret. On the screen, Stephanie's voice continued with the same cold detachment I had heard when Mr. Miller first played that recording for me. I don't want her to ever be able to find me. As far as the world is concerned, Amanda Smith is not my daughter. Kenneth sat rooted to his chair, staring at the screen as if watching a foreign film without subtitles. His face had gone through several color changes in the last few minutes, from confusion to shock to something bordering on horror. Dad. Timothy's voice was small, uncertain. Who is Amanda Smith? Before Kenneth could answer, Stephanie's eyes fluttered open. She slowly lifted her head. Mascara smeared beneath her eyes, she looked around the dining room as if she couldn't quite recall where she was. Then her gaze landed on the television screen, and reality hit her like a physical blow. "Turn it off," she whispered, then louder, more panicked. "Turn it off." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, and lunged toward the TV remote. But Kevin, our waiter, smoothly stepped between her and the screen. He looked at me, and I shook my head slightly. "Please." Stephanie turned to our table, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her designer dress wrinkled from her collapse. "This is all. This is out of context. You don't understand." "Then explain it to us." My voice was calm, firm, the voice of someone who had had months to prepare for this moment. "Who is Amanda Smith, Stephanie?" The question hung in the air like smoke around us. I could feel the weight of dozens of conversations that had stopped mid-sentence. The electricity of social drama that would be dissected in living rooms across the city for months. "She's..." Stephanie's voice broke. She looked desperately at Kenneth, searching his face for any sign that he might still be on her side. "She's my Daughter from before I met your father." "Your Daughter?" Kenneth's voice was flat, emotionless. "You have a Daughter." "I had one," Stephanie corrected quickly. "It was a long time ago, before you and I got together. It was complicated, Kenneth. You don't understand what my life was like back then." On the screen, the attorney's voice continued the conversation we were all hearing for the first time. "And you're sure you want to include the clause preventing any future contact? That's quite definitive, Ms. Meir." "Completely sure," Stephanie's recorded voice replied. "I want to start fresh. No complications from my past." Timothy pushed his chair back from the table. "How old was she when you did that?" Stephanie's eyes darted between her son and her husband. "She was 15, but you have to understand, 15. The word exploded from Kenneth as if he'd been punched in the gut. "You abandoned a 15-year-old. "I didn't abandon her," Stephanie's voice rose defensively. "She had her grandmother. She had a support system. I couldn't be a mother at that point in my life." I observed this exchange with the detached fascination of someone watching a carefully planned experiment. For months, I had wondered how Stephanie would explain herself when confronted with the truth. I had imagined different scenarios, different excuses she might use. I had not expected her to be so clumsy about it. "But you could be my mom." Timothy's voice was quiet, but it had an edge I'd never heard before. "What made me different?" The question visibly startled Stephanie. She opened and closed her mouth several times before she managed, "That's different. You're different." "How?" "You just are." Her voice grew higher, more panicked. "Timothy, you have to understand, I was young when I had Amanda. I wasn't ready. But when I met your father, when we had you, I was in a completely different place in my life." I decided to interject. Actually, Stephanie, according to the court records, you were 28 when you relinquished your rights to Amanda.
Hardly a child yourself.
The silence that followed my words was so complete I could hear the clatter of kitchen staff in the back of the restaurant. Kenneth turned to me for the first time since the video began.
You knew about this? I found out 4 months ago. I met his gaze calmly.
I hired a private investigator after I saw Stephanie coming out of a law firm downtown.
I wanted to know what she was hiding.
You had me investigated.
Stephanie's voice went higher. You violated my privacy. You had no right.
I had every right. My voice cut through her protests like a blade.
You married my son.
You became part of my family, and something about you never felt right. The video on the screen was drawing to a close, but the attorney's final question hung in the air like a judgment.
And what should we do if Amanda Smith ever tries to contact you in the future?
Stephanie's recorded voice was crystal clear in its answer.
Tell her I'm dead.
The collective gasp from the neighboring tables was audible. Even some of the restaurant staff paused to stare at our table. Timothy's face had gone completely pale.
You wanted her to think you were dead?
It was kinder that way, Stephanie said desperately.
Don't you see?
It was better for her to have a clean break, to move on without wondering why I left. That way, she could grieve and heal instead of spending her life hoping I'd come back. That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard, Kenneth said quietly.
Selfish?
Stephanie whirled on him.
I was trying to protect her. I was trying to do what was best for everyone.
No, I said. My voice cut through her hysteria with quiet authority. You were trying to protect yourself. You wanted a fresh start with Kenneth and Timothy, and Amanda was an inconvenience.
That's not true.
Then where is she now, Stephanie? I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen, where I had pulled up a recent photo Mr. Miller had taken of Amanda leaving her night job. Where is this daughter you supposedly protected? Stephanie stared at the photo, and for a moment, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across her face. Amanda looked tired in the picture, wearing a security guard uniform, walking to her car in an empty parking lot at 3 a.m.
She's... Stephanie's voice hit. I have to go.
Kenneth, wait. Stephanie reached for his arm, but he flinched away from her touch.
Don't, he said quietly. Just don't.
He turned to Timothy.
Son, are you coming with me?
Timothy looked back and forth between his parents. Confusion and pain warred on his young face. Finally, he nodded and stood up. This isn't over, Stephanie said. Her voice took on a harsh edge as she watched her family prepare to leave her sitting alone. You think you've won something here, Carol? You think destroying my marriage makes you a hero? I picked up my purse and stood to follow my son and grandson. Before I left, I turned back to her one last time.
I didn't destroy your marriage, Stephanie. I just made sure your husband knew who he really married.
As we walked through the dining room to the exit, I felt dozens of eyes tracking our progress. Tomorrow, this story would spread through every social circle Stephanie cared about. Her carefully constructed image as the perfect wife and mother would be replaced by the truth of her real identity. But as satisfying as that thought was, I knew this was only the beginning. Stephanie wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and she still had weapons she hadn't yet deployed. The real fight was just beginning. The first shot in Stephanie's counterattack came exactly 48 hours after the restaurant incident, in the form of a heartbreaking call from my youngest daughter Melissa, who lived 3 states away.
Mom, what's going on?
Melissa's voice was tight with worry. Stephanie called me this morning, crying. She said you've been trying to destroy her marriage for months. I was in my garden, pruning roses in the early morning stillness, when my phone rang. The morning's tranquility shattered with my daughter's words, and I sat heavily on my garden bench.
She said what?
She told me you hired someone to spy on her, that you ambushed her at Timothy's graduation dinner with some kind of trap.
Mom, she sobbed.
She said you're trying to turn the whole family against her because you never accepted her. The careful way Melissa spoke told me everything I needed to know. Stephanie had gotten to her first, had painted herself as the victim and me as the villain. I could practically hear the script my daughter-in-law had used. Probably the same one she was telling anyone who would listen. Melissa, there's more to this story than Stephanie told you. I know you two never perfectly got along, but Mom, she said you violated her privacy. She said you had her followed. There was a pause, and when Melissa rejoined, her voice was smaller. Did you really do that? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of having to defend actions that shouldn't need defending. Yes, I did. But not for the reasons she told you. Then why? How do you explain to your daughter that her brother's wife is a predator? How do you tell her that the woman who has been part of family gatherings for 15 years casually abandoned her own child? She has another daughter, Melissa. A daughter she abandoned when the girl was 15. Silence on the other end of the line, then quietly, what? Her name is Amanda. She's 23 now, working 2 jobs to put herself through community college with no family support, because Stephanie severed all legal ties to her, ensuring Amanda could never contact her again. Another long pause. Are you sure? Mom, that seems extreme even for someone you don't like. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? I have court records, video footage, everything. But even as I said it, I heard the doubt creeping into Melissa's voice. And there it was. The seed Stephanie had planted was already taking root. My own daughter was questioning my judgment, my motives, my version of events. This was how Stephanie operated. This was what I had learned from Mr. Miller's investigation. She didn't just abandon people, she systematically destroyed their credibility first, ensuring that if the truth ever came out, it would be dismissed as vengeful lies from someone with an agenda. After hanging up with Melissa, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, thinking about warfare. Most people think battles are won with dramatic gestures, grand moments of triumph. But Stephanie understood something more complex. She knew that the most effective way to win a war was to make the enemy defeat themselves. By the time my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, came over for our usual afternoon tea, I had received similar calls from 2 cousins, Kenneth's sister Deborah, and even Timothy's girlfriend. All had heard a version of the same story. Poor Stephanie, victim of a bitter mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son had found happiness. I don't want to take sides, Mrs. Johnson said cautiously, settling onto my kitchen chair with her cup of Earl Grey. But people are talking, Carol, and some of what they're saying. Well, it doesn't make you look very good. What exactly are they saying? Mrs. Johnson shifted uncomfortably. That you were jealous of Stephanie from the beginning, that you resented how happy she made Kenneth, how perfect their family seemed. They're saying you hired that detective to dig up dirt on her. And when you couldn't find anything truly damaging, you took things out of context to make her look bad. Out of context. I couldn't keep the sharpness from my voice. Mrs. Johnson, she abandoned her 15-year-old daughter. She erased her own child. How is that out of context? Well, Mrs. Johnson said slowly, according to what I heard, the girl was difficult. Misbehaved, maybe did drugs. And Stephanie was young and scared and thought the girl would be better off with other family members who could handle her better. I stared at my oldest friend, watching her repeat Stephanie's lies with the conviction of someone who wanted to believe them. Where did you hear this version? Stephanie called me yesterday. She was so upset, Carol. She said she had been planning to tell Kenneth about Amanda when the time was right. But you forced her hand by making it public. She said the whole situation was more complicated than it seemed. Of course Stephanie had called Mrs. Johnson. She was working her way through my entire support system, rewriting the story, conversation by conversation. Did she mention that Amanda has been entirely on her own since she was 17, that she aged out of foster care with no family support? Mrs. Johnson frowned. She said the girl chose to cut off contact with family, that Amanda was angry about the parental rights termination and refused to accept help. Lies, wrapped in just enough plausible detail to sound credible. Stephanie had clearly spent the last 2 days constructing a narrative that transformed her from predator to victim, from the abandoner to the abandoned. The truly masterful part was how she had positioned my investigation as the real betrayal. By focusing on my violation of privacy rather than what that investigation had uncovered, She had made me the villain in my own story. That evening, Kenneth called.
"Mom, we need to talk."
His voice was cautious, controlled, in a way that made my stomach clench. This wasn't the voice of a son calling his mother. This was the voice of someone convinced he had to manage a difficult situation.
"Of course, dear. Do you want to come over for dinner?"
"Actually, I think it would be better if we met somewhere neutral. How about the Maple Street Cafe tomorrow at 2 p.m.? Neutral, as if I were some kind of threat that needed to be contained in a public space. The next afternoon, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and chose a table in the farthest corner, where we could talk undisturbed. Kenneth walked in precisely at 2 p.m., and the way he moved, purposeful, resigned, told me this wasn't going to be the conversation I had hoped for. He sat opposite me without ordering anything, his hands folded on the table as if preparing to deliver bad news.
"Mom, I've done a lot of thinking since graduation night." "I can imagine you have."
"The thing is, what you did, having Stephanie investigated, ambushing her like that in public. It wasn't right. No matter what you found out, that wasn't the way to handle it."
I felt something cold settle in my chest. And what would have been the right way?
"Carol, you should have come to me privately. We could have talked about it as a family. Any issues you had with my wife, we could have worked through them." "Issues I had," I repeated carefully. "Kenneth, this isn't about me disliking Stephanie. This is about her abandoning her own child." According to Stephanie, the situation with Amanda was more complicated than what you saw in that video. She said she was trying to do what was best for a difficult teenager, and that you deliberately took her words out of context to make her look as bad as possible. There it was, the rewritten story, delivered by my own son with the sincere conviction of someone desperate to believe it. "Did she also tell you that Amanda is working 2 jobs to survive, that she has no family support system whatsoever?"
Kenneth's jaw tightened.
"She told me that Amanda chose to cut off contact with family, that she was angry about the parental rights termination situation and refused to accept help."
"And you believe that?"
"I believe my wife," he said firmly. "And frankly, Mom, the fact that you went so far as to dig up her past makes me question your motives." I stared at my son, seeing Stephanie's handwriting like graffiti on his face. She had taken his natural loyalty and twisted it into a weapon against me.
"My motives."
I kept my voice calm, but inside I was screaming, "Kenneth, I was trying to protect this family."
"From what?"
"From a woman who made some difficult choices as a young mother. From someone who was trying to start fresh and build a better life. From someone capable of abandoning her own child when that child becomes an inconvenience."
"You don't know what happened."
"I know exactly what happened. I have the documentation." "Documentation you obtained by violating her privacy and trust." Kenneth leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharpness I had rarely heard directed at me. "Mom, I need you to understand something. Stephanie is my wife. She is the mother of my son, and what you did to her was cruel and vindictive." The words hit me like physical blows. My own son, the child I had raised and sacrificed for, was defending the woman who had erased her own daughter from existence.
"So, what happens now?"
I asked quietly. "Now, we all try to move forward. Stephanie has agreed to consider family counseling to address the issues that led to this situation. But she needs to know she's safe from future attacks."
"Attacks?"
"She's afraid of you, Mom. She's afraid of what else you might try to do to hurt her." I almost laughed at the absurdity.
"Stephanie, afraid of me?"
The woman who had systematically destroyed a teenage girl's life, afraid of a 67-year-old grandmother who had merely revealed the truth.
"And what about Amanda?"
I asked. Kenneth's expression softened slightly. "If what you say about her situation is true, then perhaps we can find a way to help her. But Stephanie and I need to decide that together, as a family." As a family. The phrase stung because it made it clear exactly where I stood in this new dynamic. I was no longer part of the inner circle. I was now an outsider whose opinion might be consulted, but whose judgment was no longer trusted. As Kenneth left the cafe, it became clear to me that Stephanie had won the first round of this war more decisively than I had imagined. She had not only survived my revelation, She had used it to isolate me from my own family. But what she didn't understand was that I had been fighting battles longer than she had been alive, and I was far from finished. 2 weeks after my devastating coffee conversation with Kenneth, I was in my kitchen preparing dinner for one when the doorbell rang. It was almost 7 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. Since the graduation dinner incident, my social calendar had noticeably lightened, as people in my circle tried to navigate the awkward waters of taking sides in a family drama they didn't fully understand. When I opened the door, I was faced with a young woman who took my breath away. She had Kenneth's eyes and Stephanie's delicate bone structure, but something in her expression was all her own. A quiet strength, mixed with nervous determination. "Mrs. Peterson, my name is Amanda Smith. I think we need to talk." My legs almost gave out. After months of investigating her life from a distance, seeing her standing on my doorstep felt surreal, as if a character from a book had stepped into reality. "Amanda," I clutched the doorframe to steady myself. "How did you find me?" It wasn't easy. She adjusted a worn backpack on her shoulder. But when someone hires a private investigator to look into your life, word eventually gets around, especially in a city as small as Chicago. Of course, Mr. Miller had been discreet, but not invisible. In my focus on gathering information about Amanda, I hadn't considered that she might learn of the investigation. "I know this is strange," she continued, "but I drove here from Chicago because I needed to understand why someone was asking questions about me. And what I learned." She paused, her voice faltering slightly. "What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about my life." I stepped aside to let her in, my mind racing. "Please come in. Can I get you something to eat? You must be tired from the drive." "Coffee would be great, if you have any." As I busied myself making coffee, Amanda stood in my kitchen, looking around with curious eyes. She was smaller than I had expected from Mr. Miller's photos, probably barely 5 feet tall. But she had a presence that filled the room. "So, you're Stephanie's mother-in-law," she said finally. "That I am. And you're her daughter." Apparently, the word came out bitterly, even though for the past 8 years, I believed she was dead. I almost dropped the coffee pot. "What?" Amanda sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Mr. Miller had first shown me the documents exposing Stephanie's lies. When I aged out of foster care, I tried to find her. I hired a detective with money I'd saved from my first job. He came back and told me my mother had died in a car accident 2 years prior. The coffee maker gurgled in the silence that followed her words. I felt like I was drowning in the enormity of what she was telling me. "He showed me a death certificate and everything," Amanda continued. "He said he'd tracked down her last known address and found records of her demise. I grieved for her, Mrs. Peterson. I spent 3 years in therapy trying to process my feelings about losing a mother I barely knew. But she wasn't dead. No, she was here, playing happy family with your son and grandson, while I was working night shifts to pay for my community college classes." Amanda's voice was calm, but I could see her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. "Do you know what it's like to find out your mother not only abandoned you, but also paid someone to make you believe she was dead?" The room spun slightly as the full extent of Stephanie's cruelty dawned on me. It wasn't enough for her to abandon Amanda. She had to ensure the girl could never find her, could never disrupt her new life. "How did you find out the truth?" "Your detective was good, but not perfect. When he started asking questions in Chicago, it got back to the woman who used to clean my grandmother's house. She remembered me, remembered my situation. She also remembered my mother paying her to spread the car accident story, just in case anyone came looking for her." I sat down heavily opposite Amanda, feeling physically sick. She paid someone to fake her own death. A few $100s to ensure her past stayed buried. Amanda's laugh was hollow. "Cheaper than child support, I guess." "Amanda, I am so sorry. I had no idea she had gone that far." "It's not your fault." Amanda studied my face carefully. "But I need to understand why you were investigating me. What does my mother's abandoned daughter have to do with your family?" So I told her everything, about the private investigator, the video, the confrontation at the restaurant. I told her about Kenneth's refusal to believe the truth, about how Stephanie had managed to portray herself as the victim in her own story. When I finished, Amanda sat silently for a long time, processing what I had shared. She has a son, she finally said. My half-brother, Timothy. He's 22, just graduated from Stanford University, and he knows nothing about me. He knows now. He was there when the video played. Amanda nodded slowly. What did he say? He was shocked, confused. But Stephanie has worked very hard since then to control the narrative. She's convinced most of the family that the situation was more complicated than it seemed. Complicated how? I hesitated, not wanting to repeat Stephanie's lies. But Amanda needed to know what she was up against. She's telling people you were difficult, had drug problems, misbehaved. She says she made the difficult decision to have you raised by family members who could better handle your issues. Amanda's coffee cup hit the table with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. Drug abuse, misbehaved? Her voice rose in indignation. Mrs. Peterson, I was 15 years old, and my mother disappeared from my life without explanation. My grandmother was 78 and had arthritis so bad she could barely care for herself. I was getting straight A's in school and working a part-time job to help pay for groceries. I know. I've seen your school records. Then you know she's lying. I do. But unfortunately, my family seems more inclined to believe her version. Amanda stood up and walked to my kitchen window, staring out at the garden where I had been working when Melissa called to tell me about Stephanie's damage control campaign. I want to meet them, she said finally. Who? My half-brother. Your son. I want them to hear the truth directly from me. My stomach clenched with worry. Amanda, I don't think that's a good idea. Stephanie has had weeks to prepare for something like this. She'll have an explanation ready. Then we'll see how convincing her explanations are when I'm standing right there to refute them. Something in Amanda's voice reminded me of myself at her age. A quiet determination that wouldn't be swayed by other people's convenience. What do you hope to achieve? I asked gently. What do you hope for? Amanda turned back to me, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw tears in her eyes. I want my half-brother to know I exist. I want him to know that our mother is capable of erasing her own children when they become inconvenient. And I want to make sure that never happens to him. The weight of her words settled over the kitchen like dust after an explosion. Amanda wasn't here for revenge or money, or even necessarily reconciliation. She was here to protect a brother she had never met from a mother who had already proven herself capable of the unthinkable. This Saturday, there's a family barbecue, I said slowly. At Kenneth and Stephanies house. It's supposed to be a healing gathering to bring everyone together after the restaurant incident. Will you take me? I thought of Kenneth's anger, of Stephanie's carefully constructed victim narrative, of the way my own family had turned against me within a few short weeks. Yes, I said. I'll take you, because sometimes the only way to fight a lie is to drag the truth into the same room and let them battle it out face to face. The next Saturday arrived, grey and drizzly, the kind of New England weather that makes everything feel heavy and uncertain. Amanda had driven down from Chicago again, this time with a small suitcase, ready to stay the weekend if necessary. We sat in my car for several minutes outside Kenneth's house, watching through the windows as my family moved inside, preparing for their healing gathering. Are you ready for this? I asked Amanda. She smoothed her simple blue dress, the kind of outfit someone wears when they want to look respectable but can't afford anything special. No, but I don't think I ever will be, so we might as well get it over with. I knocked on the front door instead of using my key, a small acknowledgement that my status in this house had changed. When Kenneth opened the door, his face cycled through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally, a carefully controlled neutrality. Mom, I wasn't sure you'd come. I brought someone I'd like you to meet, I said, stepping aside so he could clearly see Amanda. Kenneth's eyes widened as he took in her familiar features. Even someone determined not to believe the truth couldn't overlook the family resemblance. This is Amanda Smith, I said clearly, your daughter. For a moment, Kenneth just stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at the young woman on his doorstep who shared his son's eyes and his wife's bone structure. "Hello," Amanda said simply. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." From somewhere behind Kenneth, I heard a glass shatter on the kitchen floor, followed by Stephanie's voice calling out with forced cheerfulness, "Kenneth, who's at the door?" "I think," Amanda said quietly, "it's time for a real family meeting." The moment Amanda walked into Kenneth's living room, the carefully orchestrated healing gathering transformed into something else entirely. Conversations died mid-sentence as relatives who had spent weeks debating my version of events found themselves face-to-face with the living proof of Stephanie's deception. Stephanie stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel still in her hands from cleaning up what she dropped when she heard Amanda's name. Her face had gone completely white, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked truly terrified. "Amanda." Timothy's voice came from the sofa, where he had been sitting with his girlfriend. He slowly stood, studying the young woman next to me with obvious fascination. You're my sister." "Half-sister," Amanda corrected gently. But yes, the resemblance between them was unmistakable now that they were in the same room. Both had inherited Kenneth's warm brown eyes and expressive eyebrows, though Amanda's were more defined by years of careful, low-budget grooming. "I don't understand," Kenneth said, his voice tight. "Amanda, if you're really Stephanie's daughter, why didn't you contact us sooner?" Amanda's laugh was quiet but bitter. "Because until 2 weeks ago, I thought my mother was dead." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. Across the room, family members who had spent weeks choosing sides now found themselves recalibrating everything they thought they knew. "That's not possible," Stephanie finally managed, her voice high and thin. "Amanda, honey, you know that's not true. You were angry when I remarried, and you chose to cut off contact with me." "No," Amanda said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was 15 years old when you signed the papers to terminate your parental rights. I was 17 when I aged out of foster care with no family support, and I was 20 when I hired a detective to find you, only to be told you died in a car accident." She pulled a folder from her backpack and handed it to Kenneth. "These are copies of all the documents, the court papers you signed, the fake death certificate provided to the detective I hired, even receipts showing payments made to ensure that story would hold up if anyone came looking for you." Kenneth's hand trembled as he opened the folder. I watched his face change as he read the evidence of his wife's systematic deception. "You paid someone to fake your own death?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Kenneth, you have to understand," Stephanie said desperately, moving towards him with outstretched hands. The situation was complicated. Amanda was going through a difficult phase, and I thought. "I was getting straight A's," Amanda interjected, her voice cutting through Stephanie's fabrication like a knife. "I was working a part-time job to help my elderly grandmother with groceries. The only thing I was going through was trying to understand why my mother disappeared from my life without explanation." She turned to the room, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't come here for money, or revenge, or to destroy anyone's family. I came here because I discovered that my mother, whom I grieved for 3 years believing she was dead, was living a completely different life while I struggled to survive on my own." Timothy stepped closer to her, his young face serious under the weight of understanding. "What was your life like since she left?" Amanda met his gaze calmly. "I've worked 2 jobs for the past 5 years to put myself through community college. I live in a studio apartment that costs most of my income. I had no family support, no safety net, no one to call when things got tough." She paused, her voice softening. "But I also learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible." "Oh honey," my sister-in-law Deborah spoke from across the room, her voice full of genuine sympathy. "We had no idea." "Because you were never supposed to know," Amanda replied. "My mother made sure of it." Stephanie recoiled into the kitchen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "You don't understand," she kept repeating. "None of you understand how complicated the situation was." "Then explain it to us," Kenneth said, his voice hard. "Explain how abandoning a 15-year-old and then faking your own death was the right thing to do." "She wasn't my responsibility anymore." Stephanie's facade finally broke completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. I had a new life, a new family. I couldn't drag my past with me, complicating things. The honesty of that statement hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually recoiled as if Stephanie's words were contaminated. So, you just erased her, Timothy said quietly.
You erased your own Daukarte.
I did what I had to do. Stephanie's voice rose to an almost shrill pitch. You think it was easy? You think I wanted to give up my child? But I had to choose between my past and my future.
And I chose my future.
You chose yourself, Amanda said with devastating simplicity. You prioritized your own comfort over the well-being of your child. Kenneth placed the folder on the coffee table and looked at his wife with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but complete realization of who she truly was. Get out, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. Stephanie, get out of my house. Get out of my life. Get away from my family. Your family. Stephanie's voice turned venomous. Half of everything in this house is mine, half your assets, half your pension. You can't just kick me out. Actually, Kenneth said with grim satisfaction, I can. The prenuptial agreement you insisted on works both ways, Stephanie. If either spouse commits fraud or behaves in a manner that materially misrepresents their character, the marriage can be dissolved without financial obligation. You wouldn't want to leave your child and fake your own death to conceal it from your new family. That seems like a material misrepresentation to me, Kenneth continued. My attorney will contact you regarding the divorce proceedings. I watched Stephanie look around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. Even the relatives who had been most inclined to give her the benefit of the doubt now stared at her with unconcealed revulsion. You'll regret this, she finally said, her voice quiet and dangerous. All of you. You have no idea what you're throwing away. A liar and a child abandoner, Amanda said. I think we'll manage. After Stephanie left, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows, the family spent the rest of the evening getting to know Amanda. She told them about her life in Chicago, her job as a night security guard, and her dreams of becoming a social worker. She showed them pictures of the small apartment she was so proud of, the first place that had ever truly belonged to her. But what struck me most was how naturally she fit into our family dynamic. She had Kenneth's dry wit and his practical approach to problems. She shared Timothy's love of books and his quiet intensity when it came to things that mattered to her. Seeing my grandson and his half-sister discover their connection was like watching two puzzle pieces finally click into place. I can't believe I have a sister, Timothy said at one point, shaking his head in wonder. Half-sister, Amanda corrected gently. But she was smiling. Sister, he insisted. The half part is just biology. Sisters are a matter of choice. 6 months later, I was in my kitchen preparing Sunday dinner for a larger crowd than I had hosted in years. Amanda had transferred to a school near US, and Kenneth was helping her with tuition. Timothy had convinced her to move into the guest room of his apartment, claiming he desperately needed a study partner for his state exams. The divorce had been finalized surprisingly quickly after Kenneth's attorney presented the evidence of Stephanie's deception. She had disappeared from our lives as thoroughly as she had once disappeared from Amanda's, leaving behind only the memories of the havoc she had tried to wreak. But perhaps the most satisfying change was in my relationship with my family. The crisis had stripped away all the polite pretenses and careful social maneuvers that had defined our interactions for years. We were closer now, more honest with each other, more willing to have difficult conversations. Amanda appeared in my kitchen doorway, holding a bottle of wine. Kenneth sent me to ask if you needed help. I smiled at the title she had chosen for me. Not Mrs. Peterson, not Carol, but Grandma, a term that acknowledged her place in our family structure while respecting the relationship she had built with my son and grandson. I think we're almost done, I said, checking the roast in the oven. How are you settling into school? Better than expected. She leaned against the counter, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in those first tense meetings. It's strange, having people who care if I succeed or fail. I'm still getting used to it. Good strange or bad strange? Definitely good. She paused, then added softly, "Thank you for everything. For the investigation, for the confrontation, for bringing me into this family. I know it wasn't easy." I studied her face, seeing not just the young woman she had become, but also fleeting glimpses of the frightened 15-year-old who had been abandoned, the determined 17-year-old who had aged out of foster care, the hopeful 20-year-old who had grieved for a mother who was never truly dead. "You did the hard part," I told her. "You survived. You built a life for yourself without help from anyone. All I did was make sure the truth came out." "All you did," Amanda repeated with a smile, "was save me from believing for the rest of my life that I wasn't worth loving." From the dining room, I heard Kenneth and Timothy debating something with the passionate intensity that seemed to run in our family. The sound of their voices, now accompanied by Amanda's laughter, filled my house with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Stephanie had tried to erase Amanda from existence, to protect her perfect life from the inconvenience of her past choices. But in the end, her cruelty had only knit our family closer together. Amanda wasn't a burden to be hidden. She was the missing piece of the puzzle we never knew we needed. As we sat down to dinner that Sunday, I looked around the table at my son, my grandson, and the granddaughter I had gained through tragedy and truth. This wasn't the family Stephanie had tried to build through lies and manipulation. This was better. This was real. Now I'm curious about those of you who have heard my story. What would you do in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar? Comment below. And in the meantime, on screen, I'm showing 2 more stories that are channel favorites, and they'll definitely surprise you. Thank you so much for watching this far. If you enjoy my stories and want me to keep creating content like this, I would greatly appreciate your support. Every small contribution helps me bring these stories to life and share them. Thank you. Carol.